Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. If you would have told me on the night that Donald Trump was elected as president that over the next 4 years we would experience a major pandemic, economic fallout, major fires, at least in my state of California, that created so much smoke it actually blotted out the sun and turned the sky orange, that we would have experienced political violence in the streets, that we would have seen an insurrection on the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and that the president would be impeached twice. If you would have told me all of that on election night, I probably would have believed you. But if you would have told me that, say, a year and a half ago, I probably would not have believed you, considering just how much has happened in this last year and a half. And I think for a lot of us, especially myself, we're trying to put this in perspective, trying to kind of figure out what happened, trying to think about how does this fit in American history? How does this fit in the long view or even big picture? Well, today I'm very happy to welcome back to our radio program to, I think, help us process this in some ways and talk about these issues. Somebody that we've had the great pleasure of having on this show before, and that is Manisha Sinha. Now, Manisha Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and she is a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. She is the author of several books, including The Counterrevolution of Slavery and also The Slave's Cause. In November 2019, last year, and this is when we started talking to her, she wrote the piece in the New York Times, is Donald Trump, a piece about Donald Trump and comparing it to the first impeachment of a president, Andrew Johnson. She joins us via Skype. Manisha Sinha, as I indicated, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to this program. Thank you for taking this time today.
Thank you for having me, Mitch.
How do you make sense of, and I guess maybe especially what we've seen in the last month, never mind the 4 years, how do you make sense of what we have witnessed happening in our political life as a historian?
So I think we are actually at a rather dangerous crossroads in the history of American democracy. What we saw on January 6th, the assault on Congress by a violent, seditious mob, riled up by the president himself, is rather unprecedented. People have looked at it and said, this is not America, and others have said, this is exactly America. And in a way, both have a point. This is certainly not America because we have never had in the recent past such a consistent and violent questioning of the result of a perfectly normal presidential election. In fact, one that was conducted in the middle of a pandemic and one of our safest presidential elections. So all the allegations of fraud, etc., have been just put forward by conspiracy theorists and by Trump himself, and have been enabled by the Republican Party. If you look in the past and you look at violent mobs overthrowing democratically elected governments or trying to interfere in the election process, you have to go right back to Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, when the Ku Klux Klan was organized in 1866, and many other white supremacist terror groups rose up in the South in order to literally challenge the results of the Civil War, which was emancipation and eventually Black rights and voting rights for Black men. So you had the creation of democratic interracial governments in the South, and the white South reacted through a program of violent intimidation and electoral fraud, voter intimidation and fraud. And that's exactly how Trump and his followers are reacting today. Just as the Democratic Party enabled that in the 19th century, today the Republican Party is enabling it. The parties have literally switched their roles. And I think it's extremely dangerous because even though we have impeached Trump, there are still an overwhelming majority of Republicans who refuse to distance themselves from a violent attack on our democratic process. And that's dangerous.
That's very interesting, this parallel between the Republican Party today and the Democratic Party in the mid to late 19th century. I mean, when you were saying that, I couldn't help but think, like, yeah, we even with the storming of the Capitol, we saw some protesters carrying Confederate flags.
Exactly. And if you think about it, during the Civil War, when Washington, D.C. was constantly under attack, right? It was surrounded by slaveholding states like Virginia, which was part of the Confederacy, Maryland, that was a border slave state still in the Union. And there was a constant threat that Washington, D.C. would be attacked by these people. And that was foiled by a strong response by the federal government in the middle of the war. So the Confederate flag that never made an appearance in the Capitol during the war made its first appearance in that assault on American democracy. And in a way, in order to understand the present, we must understand the past. We must understand how we got here. And a lot of these fringe white supremacist conspiracy groups, which seem to have overtaken the Republican Party today, are really descendants of these white terror groups in the 19th century that refused to accept the elections. This was also a tipping point before the Civil War when white slaveholders and their allies started invading Kansas in the 1850s and literally stealing elections just through sheer violence and mob action. That was a tipping point in the North with many Northern men, Northern white, predominantly Northern white men who could vote at that time, choosing to go with a new party, an anti slavery Republican Party, rather than with the old parties, and reacting to that assault on American democratic norms. Abolitionists had always been saying that slavery was wrong, that it was morally abhorrent. But they were a minority in the North well into the 1850s. In the 1850s, they got a lot more following amongst Northern white citizens who finally saw slavery in their back door. They saw the so-called slave power literally stealing elections through violence and through intimidation. And they wanted to put a stop to that. And that's why Lincoln got elected.
This is what we call Kansas bleeding. This was basically a low-level guerrilla war that was occurring in Kansas over the issue of whether or not Kansas would be a slave state or not. This is where somebody like John Brown really makes his appearance on the scene.
Yes, so John Brown was the abolitionist who decided to respond to slaveholders with their own weapons, who decided that the free staters needed to defend themselves, that they needed to defend themselves, self-defense, violence and self-defense, because, this is when you have the sack of Lawrence, which was the capital of the free staters. It's when you have instances of people being murdered in cold blood for their political viewpoints. And John Brown said, well, we free staters have had enough of that. And he galvanized a response in defense. And this is exactly where Brown is radicalized. Before that, of course, he had also recommended armed self-defense to fugitive slaves who were being hunted down in the North after the passage of the draconian fugitive slave law. So yes, this is where John Brown decides to fight fire with fire. This is where he decides that slavery would not indeed be removed from the body politic unless it was violently challenged. And that's the course he did take in Harper's Ferry.
Yeah, and this John Brown's mostly remembered today for the failed raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. But for me, the real story of John Brown is kind of bleeding, or Kansas bleeding. What happens there? He committed his own massacres, and then he even had his own son that was killed in the fighting in the mid 18 50s. You also get voter fraud in this period of time because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which really probably would help lead to the Civil War. That basically said all new free states that come in to the all new states that come into the country that become a part of the Union will decide for themselves whether or not they will be a slave state or not.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise line, which allowed slavery then to expand north of the line, and that's why it received, why Northerners were so excised about it. This was a long-standing compromise that slavery would, in fact, expand, which it did horrifically with the rise of the Cotton Kingdom below the Missouri Compromise line, which was the southern border of the state of Missouri, and that indeed the territories above it would be free states. And that's how the Union would continue as a balance between free and slave states. What Stephen Douglas did with the Kansas-Nebraska Act is, as you explained, put into place the principle of what he called popular sovereignty, that white men, adult white male citizens, settlers to a territory would decide whether they would enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. And that's the platform that Lincoln opposed. Lincoln said that the federal government should actively prohibit the expansion of slavery into territories, because in the history of the Republic, in every territory that slavery was allowed, they came into the Republic as a slave state because the fact was already established. The slavery was already there. Now, when Stephen Douglas had this plan, he eventually broke with his own party as a Northern Democrat because of these border ruffians from Missouri who invaded Kansas and stole elections. An overwhelming majority of the immigrants to Kansas, they were coming from New England too, like John Brown, for anti-slavery purposes, but an overwhelming majority were from the surrounding lower north states. They were not particularly abolitionist. Many of them just wanted a free state. So when the border ruffians stole these elections and established a Kansas state government, they represented 10% of the population. And that was the slave state constitution that the Democrats were trying to push through in Congress when Stephen Douglas said no. Stephen Douglas didn't really care about slavery, but he did care about the white man's democracy. And to him, that was a tipping point because slaveholders were asking him to sanction a constitution, the Lee-Compton Constitution, that represented just 10% of the immigrants in Kansas. So like today, the people who cry voter fraud were the ones who actually were committing it in wide scale and were also using violence to force their will, to force a minority will, the will of slaveholders, against a broader majority. And that's why Lincoln always connected the fight over slavery to the very survival of democracy, because it was minority rule versus the majority. And I think we are back there. We are back there in square one today.
Minority rule.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think one can make the argument the Republicans are trying to institute, trying to hold on to power now, as the demographics in this country are working against them.
Absolutely. They are acting against this very prospect of an interracial democracy in this country. Ironically enough, Trump and his authoritarianism attracted actually some Black and Latino voters and some minority voters in the last elections. So it's not just, a simple divide, but it is true that the Republican Party today has a large segment of people committed to white supremacy, anti-democratic minority rule, in the way that the Democratic Party and slaveholders were in the 1850s. The reason why we had a civil war was because Southern slaveholders from the lower South states refused to accept the results of an election. they refused to accept the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency. And that kind of a revolt against American democracy, has not happened since. So I think it is important for us to look back at that sorry history, and especially to those people who should know better, who have been enabling the lies and the disinformation about the elections, and who have been concocting wild conspiracy theories, and appealing to the insane. Literally, they are not even sane, to the insane base of their party. QAnon conspiracy theorists, right wing, reactionary, white supremacist groups, armed and dangerous groups. They should really take a pause in their career of political folly to know how this turns out for them in the end.
It's really fascinating to think about how this is all, a lot of this is based on conspiracy theories. And can you think of parallels in historical parallels concerning, people who react to conspiracy theories this way? I mean, I guess for me, I think of 20th century historian. I think his name was Richard Hofstadter, who wrote the Paranoid Style in American Politics. I might be off a little bit there, but basically he was writing about the rise of Barry Goldwater and the movement in the mid 20th century.
He was. He was writing about the rise of the modern right in the United States, which itself was a reaction to the civil rights movement and to the next creation of an interracial democracy in this country. And there have always been these conspiracy theorists on the right. During the New Deal, you had Father Coughlin, the Catholic priest, who had a very popular radio show, a lot like what's his name, one of those deplorables.
I can name a few of them. We can go Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Tucker Carlson. I mean, there's a bunch.
Rush Limbaugh is who I was thinking about. Sean Hannity's on television, but clearly Fox News, not the news so much now, but it's news shows. They shouldn't be called news shows because they're really Goebbels level propaganda shows. People like Judge Pirot, Sean Hannity. These men replicate Father Coughlin, who in his radio addresses would whip up anti-Semitic frenzy. The rise of Hitler, of course, made racism unpopular in the world, in the civilized world. And I think they have been dealing with that fallout. They have been dealing with the fallout of the civil rights movement domestically. And at one point, I think these people on the right are willing to go full blown fascist. They do not listen. Their reality that they construct is based on a steady stream of lies and conspiracies, and this has been amplified with the growth of social media in this country, where any person can purport to say this is a fact when it may not be at all. My husband, who's German, tells me that it reminds him a lot of Weimar Germany when the Nazis literally took control of the press and the radio and constructed their own reality for all Germans. And look where that got us. So again, I think unless we dismantle this disinformation empire that would put Goebbels to shame, and unless we really dismantle people within the democratic process who are undermining it from within, enablers within the Republican Party of Donald Trump, who has proven to be a congenital liar, who has proven to be a person who will burn down the house rather than leave it, and who has no sense of patriotism or responsibility, who probably has never read the US Constitution. The fact that he was even elected is a problem. It's a problem with our electoral college, the way presidential elections work in this country. We need some serious democratic reforms, or we will find ourselves losing our republic.
So, some could accuse me of going back to the Civil War era too much on this program. We've done a number of shows, and it really went all the way back to the beginning. At the beginning of the Trump administration, I went to Washington, D.C. I used to be a Capitol Hill correspondent, so I went back to D.C. just to try to get a grip on what was going on. And as soon as I got there, I realized no one knew what was going on. They're like, we don't know. But the one beneficial thing that happened for me in that trip is I met and sat down with Betty Coed, who is the official Senate historian. She has an office in the Senate Hart Building. And I just kind of looked at her. I'm like, can you ever think of such a crazy and volatile political moment in history? And she just laughs at me. She's like, yeah, of course. The 1850s was really crazy, the decade before the Civil War. And so almost immediately I had this Civil War connection. And I even thought about this during yesterday's debate or on Thursday's debate or Wednesday's debate on the House of Representatives concerning impeachment, when you have members accusing the president of insurrection and including accusing other members in Congress of aiding an insurrection. I was like, wow, we haven't had language like this in Congress probably since the Civil War. This is really remarkable. And then, when we started talking to you, it was in connection with the Andrew Johnson impeachment in 1868, still very much a part of this era. And then even recently, we've done a number of shows on the 1876 election as sort of a parallel to what we've been experiencing recently. So, I mean, yeah, I could be accused of probably going a little too hard on the Civil War, but no parallels are perfect, but this one just, it seems like we went through a whole Civil War, 2 decades of Civil War era, maybe 3 in 4 years.
Yeah, it's really not your fault because history doesn't occur in direct parallels. I do think it occurs first as tragedy and then as farce, and we are going through the farcical sort of emulation of the Civil War divisions. But I think part of the reasons why you find that period so resonant today is because those issues are unresolved. If you think of the debates over Confederate monuments, if you think of the massive protests in the movement for Black lives that led to the taking down of iconic Confederate monuments, it shows you that we are still living with the legacies, the unresolved legacies of the Civil War and Reconstruction, which was Black citizenship. Have we achieved that? Yes, slavery ended, but Black citizenship has been contested in this country since then. First, with the fall of Reconstruction, and it was kind of laughable to hear Ted Cruz, who I hear is now being called Ted Coup, evoke the 1876 elections because the compromise that put Rutherford B. Hayes into the presidency by that election commission resulted in the end of Reconstruction in the South, and it meant Jim Crow, racial terror and lynching, economic servitude, sharecropping, convict lease labor system for Black people. So it undid the results of the Civil War. And, the North may have won the war, the South won the peace for nearly 100 years till we get the civil rights movement to actually implement the laws and the constitutional amendments that were passed after the Civil War. So it's a really long durée story of American democracy. And, the fact that we are referring to these events is because politicians themselves are. For instance, Trump, who thinks Confederate monuments are beautiful and should not be taken off, who thinks our military bases should be named after traitors and seditionists, Confederate generals, who opposes changing those names, even though the military wants to do that. And people evoking the past in order to justify their current political positions. And this has been done especially by people on the right. And I think it is important for us to realize that, we really do need to know the long historical lineages of some of these political positions because then you will truly understand their pernicious nature and the grave threat that these ideas represent to our republic and to American democracy.
Manisha Sinha, before we went on air, we were talking about the joys of going through the historical archives, something that you like to do, especially going through the old documents. So, in that, you know that it's almost impossible right now to know how future historians will look back at this moment and how they interpret it. But do you ever think about that? Do you ever think about how future historians look back at this moment we're going through now?
It will depend on the result. If the Biden Harris administration and the Democratic majorities in the Senate and House take decisive action to defeat this, and if we are able to actually bring back a semblance of democracy and law and order in this, not law and order, I should say the rule of law in this country, we would have a different ending to Reconstruction than the first time around. And so future historians will look back the way I look back at Reconstruction, at the moment lost, the opportunity lost, if we fail to do that. But in fact, if we overcome and we manage to, hold people accountable for their seditious violence against the government of the United States, then maybe we look back and say, oh, we faced great danger and we met it and we overcame it. So it really depends on the results of what happened. And that's why I am calling for a third reconstruction of American democracy and invoking some of the most punitive measures from the Civil War era against insurrection and sedition, because this is the largest domestic insurrection we've had since the insurrection of slaveholders.
That's very interesting. We're down to our last 90 seconds, but I do think you brought up something important, and that was the lost opportunities during the Civil War. The lost opportunity of actually convicting, being short by one vote, Andrew Johnson in the impeachment that would have made Hannibal Hanlon, or not Hannibal Hanlon, excuse me. No, it would have made the Senate pro tempore.
Yeah, Benjamin Wade.
Wade, who was an abolitionist.
He was a radical Republican. Yeah. And in fact, one of the reasons why some of those moderate Republicans voted against convicting Johnson was because they didn't want Wade to take over either. Yeah. And so, they had a loss of heart, like a lot of so-called moderates and centrists today who, when there's a fight, you have to bring out your inner Thaddeus Stevens, not your inner people willing to compromise with democracy.
Manisha Sinha has been our guest. Manisha Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, leading authority on the history of slavery, abolition, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. She's the author of several books, including The Counterrevolution of Slavery. Her latest book is called The Slave's Cause. She's working on a new book on Reconstruction, which we can't wait for it to come out so we could talk to her about that. Professor Sinha, always informative, and thank you for taking this time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.